Well, hi there. And I thought today would be a good time to delve into what does the word agrarian mean? Where does that come from? And it's a derivation of the word agriculture, and that is the culture of growing things, basically. And agrarian implies those who are engaged in that process. And so oftentimes nowadays when we think of farmer, we think of someone that's growing vegetables or fruits or a rancher that's growing animals, but it also includes hay, grains, our fiber crops, cotton of this thing, and also unique building materials that may be grown, things like bamboo and linen, flax, that type of thing. So it encompasses a large amount of the culture. And up until about a century ago, about 3/4 of people in the United States here were engaged in agriculture in some way, whether they were directly working in the fields or helping process material, working, in a cotton gin or some kind of secondary value adding or transporting. And all of this is part of an agrarian culture. And any of you that have lived in farm country know this. And the grid pattern of roads and all the trucking and tractors and mechanics and all the ancillary support things of what is an agrarian culture. So when we're talking about agrarian renaissance, we're not just talking about new ways of growing things or new crops. It's a whole reboot. And recently, when I was in Kenya, there were these agrovet shops, and that's where all the fertilizers and pesticides and biocides and seeds are distributed through. And here we have our farm stores that not only provide the things for growing it, but also things like Carhartts and tools and what supports the culture. So as we begin to broaden the parentheses that define who is included in that, it's a fairly broad element of people. Also, people like bookkeepers that keep the books for this type of thing. And I think it's helpful to widen our view to consider that, because if they're all doing well, then we create resilient communities. So within this idea of the agrarian renaissance, I think it's good to go back to how did agriculture start? We all came from hunter-gatherer peoples, and it wasn't like all of a sudden we shifted from hunter-gatherers to farmers. There was something, and this is germane to this conversation that I read recently, that was looking at why do we feel at peace after time in nature? When we were hunter-gatherer people, which represents, so this Homo sapiens as a species has been around for, let's say, 300,000 years. Us as a larger hominoid distinct from the other primates, let's say 3 million years. So that represents, the last 10% of the time we've been this, and then the last 300 years, 1% of the time, we've been in this more industrial model. So for the vast majority of our time in this body with this brain and this kind of nervous system, we were hunter-gatherers. So when we walked through the savannah or the forest, subconsciously, we were telling ourselves in some way, some subconscious way, oh, that's a plant that will heal. That's a plant that's food. That plant I can make sandals out of. That one I can make a shelter out of. You were completely surrounded and immersed with the means for your own survival constantly. But then when we shifted to agriculture 5 to 10,000 years ago, and it was a segue, really, and we'll get to that in a moment, we had to take responsibility for that. And let's say we're a parent, or we're in a family unit of some sort. We had to say, okay, I need enough food for the winter for this many people. Okay, we got to do some math. So all of a sudden math became a thing. But also scarcity and needing to protect your crops, whatever it is, and also for governance to do that. So we got away from that natural peace. So that's part of our limbic system. When we get around nature, we just take a deep breath and we're like, oh, everything's okay. Not that we have the skills today to fashion fishing material if we're at a mountain lake without modern technology to obtain fish, or process acorns, which only happen for a brief period of the year, into food. But there is something still to our subconscious. And I think it's worth starting there because this form that we're in arose in a hunter-gatherer situation. And this agrarian way of living is still an experiment by and large. Even though it seems so refined with these huge tractors and all the modern technology, there's a lot of externalities and pollution that's still associated with that. So we can see it's not truly working. Whereas the pollution of old agriculture was the fertilizer. It literally was what made it go. So I want to just stop there for a minute and then kind of look at like, well, where did agriculture start? And David Graeber, in his excellent book, the Dawn of Everything, which is a new history for humanity, there's newer science available, I think, particularly as people are able to go out on a limb and perhaps challenge their mentors or professors, in that perhaps grains were not domesticated for the grain, the kernel, the seed, but for the straw to use for making fire, dry grass. Think about it. If you're going to start a fire out in nature, dry grass is, if you have access to it, is just about the best thing possible. So if you find a longer dry grass, let's save some of that up, keep it dry under a little bark shed or something for starting a fire. Well, inadvertently, some of the seed would be attached to it and spill as you're making a fire, and all of a sudden those grains, or primordial grains, begin to sprout up in the very same area that the people in the village are fertilizing with their own human waste, or their domesticated animals are fertilizing. And also, these long cereal grains, the progenitors to wheat, oats, rye, this type of thing, made really good thatch and could be woven into your roof or into baskets, or maybe even shingled. The indigenous people of this area would make these shingled red cedar bark capes that would shed rain because you have no raincoats in the Pacific Northwest and a rainforest. So that is an interesting thing, just to look at how it started. It isn't like somebody said, oh, hey, I bet if we take those and save the seed and plant, we'll get more of it. And then, fast forward a bit, there is just a element of evolution of a plant that produces more seed. If you're saving the seed, will represent itself as a larger proportion each time you grow it out, whereas the plants that don't do well due to disease or some other condition won't be as much of the population. So over time, once we started doing this process, we had plants that were making more seeds, more fruits, more nuts, all of this stuff around our villages. And in Mesoamerica, which is one of the centers of origin of agriculture, that they call it dump heap gardening. Because basically people would walk to the edge of the little camp, the village, and throw the avocado pits, the banana peels, whatever it was, to the edge. And then animals would come and eat that compost and poop and fertilize. And over time, those would become, anyone who's had a garden has had some kind of summer squash type thing sprout out of their compost. And we still see this dump heap type of agriculture proliferating. And then in that area of Mesoamerica, Central America, South America, Swidden agriculture, the use of fire to come in and thoughtfully burn, which is transforming carbon into ash and creating a fertility cycle and opening up sunlight to come down and grow weedy annuals. And one of my mentors, Tom Ward, who now goes by the name Tomi Hazel, made the statement that most of our agriculture is growing weedy annuals in arrested succession. And most of our vegetables and our grains are weedy annuals. They're annual crops that grow quickly, make a lot of food, and then we use it. But then when it's time to start the cycle again, we just go right back to square zero. Whereas in a natural ecosystem, plant succession starts with weeds, annual weeds, and goes to perennial weeds and thistles, and then to shrubs and small trees and bigger trees and vines. And there's a stair stepping up, and that's where we have it wrong nowadays, because we're not doing that unless you're doing permaculture or food forests in some way. So back to this, the origins of agriculture. Humans had to play a role where we had to take responsible for our own needs. So when it was hunter-gatherers, we've all read these types of things, that they had all this time for art and leisure because they didn't have to spend time tilling and planting and harvesting. They're still harvesting and processing, but hunter-gatherers had a different lifestyle, and then they weren't so tied down to this is our land. It was a more migratory pattern. So very different way of living. Once we were agrarian, we stayed in one place and we had to store food. So then the idea of surplus begat commerce and trade, because you might have more than you need and say, I could trade you this for that. Or we can use this token currency, whether it was actual physical money like metals, coins, or here in the northwest of the United States, they use dentilium shells, these long skinny shells that could be threaded on a string, and many people would actually have tattoos to measure the longer shells were worth more. And the idea of what was a store of wealth and value came out of agriculture. And then that started accounting and the other more specialized trades, because then when we move from hunter-gatherer to everything's done by hand to actually plows, okay, well there's going to be a specialization of labor, and somebody's going to become the blacksmith that's making the plow, or the person that's making it out of a tree root or something like this. And another person specializing on when we have surplus of this particular root, we ferment it down and make an alcoholic beverage. And that becomes another medium of exchange. So you can really see how agriculture was the starting point of civilization. Before that, it was a different thing. I'm not saying that's uncivilized. I think that there's a lot of benefits of that, and you can see this modern interest in ancestral skills and primitive skills, I think, is a recognition of what we've lost with going for agriculture for everything. And I think as we look at the segue from hunter-gatherer to farmer, for instance, corn, the first genetic evidence of corn, Zea maiz, most people call it maize, coming from Mexico, where it started as a wild plant, teosinte, Zea mexicana, and the highlands, Mexican highlands near Oaxaca, Mexico, present-day Oaxaca. It didn't make it into what's now the political boundaries of the United States until about 900 AD, so less than a millennia ago. And it didn't make it all the way up into where the real corn bean squash people, the Three Sisters, the Iroquois, Seneca, Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, those peoples, until about 1200 AD. So think of that time period between 1492, Columbus, and I don't know the actual date of when the first white colonists stepped foot on, what would be New England area, because obviously Columbus was down there more in the Caribbean. But that's not that much time, less than 300 years between that. So it wasn't like the Confederated Tribes of the Iroquois had been doing corn, bean, squash for a long time. They were still relying on acorns, deer, hunting wild turkeys, chestnut trees, probably all manner of wild fruits, nuts, and animals. And they had their gardens, growing corn, bean, squash, among other crops, and probably eating the weeds and herbs that grew at the forest edge. So there was a hybrid. And I do think it's really fascinating, and we'll explore this in a future episode of the Agrarian Renaissance. I'll bring in a guest who's an expert on wild food, that there's a really strong impulse among young people, from what I see, and in my own self, to find a hybrid between the two, because I do think that's a bit of our natural state of being, because there is a value to agriculture, for sure. It's successful. Clearly, we've seen population growth as a result. So we go back to that hybrid time where people are hunting, gathering, and farming, and then they have resilience because they can lean into both ways. Whereas the first white settlers that were relying purely on agriculture, and they were unfamiliar with the landscape, that starvation was regular because they were not indigenous to that landscape and didn't understand, in times of starvation we can actually eat this plant or this root or something like that. So over time, you can see how this storing of food to make it through the winter then meant that was also the birth of needing to know parentage and the patriarchy. Because a woman knows how many children she's had. pretty much, I would venture a guess that 99% of women know how many children they've had. Men, throughout time, might not know. So then, so it's an interesting thing. Like, so patriarchy, but it's the woman ultimately being like, we've got 5 kids. We need to store enough food. We need to grow and store enough food to keep our 5 kids alive. And so securing that and developing some level of governance to ensure that people aren't stealing, but also protecting it from mice and other pests. So then having domesticated animals as a relationship to that. And then also all of the pottery and basketry technologies to store all of that in root cellars. And you can see how that technology and that innovation extrapolated from that time. But then as you got to places of surplus, and we'll kind of set the stage for the next episode that's a follow-up to this one here. Once you've got surplus, then it's like, oh, well, not everybody needs to be a farmer. And as we create innovations of going from metal plows from wooden plows, or from human-powered plows to draft horse or oxen-powered plows, all of a sudden it means that one farmer or one farming family can grow food for more people. So you have more room for specialization and artisans, but also people to be the accountants, to keep track of how much food is moving through the thing, or what is a exchange of value. And I think this is something, at least I didn't learn this in school. I do not think they teach this in our public schools, but it's so foundational to who we are as a people that I do think is an important starting point to consider this kind of, oh, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, that led to a situation that by 1930 here in the United States, about 70% of the populace was involved in agriculture in some way. Not to say that they were all farmers. Some of them were probably truckers or, working in somewhere in the larger agricultural sphere. So then 30% of society was the services and administration, the religious figures, the political figures, all of that. And then now think of from 1930 to now, which is less than 100 years, and we'll leave you on a kind of a cliffhanger for our next one. We've gone to less than 1% of Americans are farmers. And I would venture a guess, I'd say 5% are involved in agriculture in some way. And if we want to be super generous and include everybody that works in a grocery store somewhere, maybe it's 10%. I'm not quite sure what all those other 90% of the people do, but they're not the ones involved with meeting our most basic needs of eating. And part of that's technology, part of it's fossil fuels that enables one person to do the work of many. And that is something worth exploring, because as we've made that exchange of that relationship, we have mental health issues, we have physical health issues, and we've also lost that relationship with the agrarian lifestyle of being outside, of sunlight, of being connected to nature, the rhythms, the seasons, our neighbors, and all people who are gardening and farming around the planet. Wherever you go, there's a certain kindred nature that occurs there. And many people are waking up to that point right now, and that's really where we have to breathe our creativity into the Renaissance, because I firmly believe the way forward is not backwards. We're not going back to all living like, Amish farmers or, peasant agriculture anytime soon, because we have this technology. But perhaps, in the words of Richard Heinberg, he wrote the great peak oil book called The Party's Over, he said, we need to go back to being a nation of 1 million small farmers. And David Holmgren coined this term garden agriculture, that we need garden agriculture, little 1/4 acre, 1/8 acre raised bed with beehives and chickens, and intensive, but actually producing a lot of food, not just pansies and flowers. And recently I saw Joel Salatin repeated the same thing. We need to become a nation of 1 million small family farmers. And if we were to do that, I think we would regain the sovereignty and the power that goes with that. And I'll close with a quote. I'm just going to paraphrase. It's an old Chinese saying. I greet each day with the sun. I gather my own water from the well. The food on my table comes from the sweat of my own brow. I touch creation every day. Kings can do no more. And I feel like once we get back to that, that's what people are yearning for. There's an emptiness in you unless you have that. And you might not know it, and you might try and fill that up with all manner of addiction and other things. But it is that, and that's why I love that quote. You touch creation. You're touching literally where the water, whatever it is coming right out of nature. And then you realize you are that. It's really no different than you. You don't have power over it. You're in this position. You're not in a dominating position. So these are the kind of things we want to explore with this Renaissance, because it's a recapitulation of our thinking and our relationality of not being over or under, but part of. So thank you for your time.